I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the new Mercedes-AMG GLA 35, the first of two AMG GLAs to arrive in this new second generation form here in Australia. The 35, which uses a 225 kilowatt tune of Benz's family 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, is the first to get here, but the GLA 45, which has an absolutely bonkers bespoke 2-litre making 310 kilowatts of power, will be here in early 2021. That being said, there are some reasons why the GLA 35 might be a better fit for your lifestyle. It's easy to look at the numbers and say, oh well, it's a softer AMG, so therefore it's not as good as the GLA 45. But that's a big simplification. Because the GLA 35 is really a very warm or mildly hot all-rounder that's actually easier to live with every day than its GLA 45 sibling, which is really quite extroverted and quite firm. Compared to that car, the GLA 35 is quite a bit more toned down, both in aesthetics and in terms of ride quality, and as we'll find out when we take this car for a drive, that's actually quite a good blend for Australian roads. Now, no doubt the GLA 45 will be something very special indeed, but we certainly shouldn't write off the 35 as a good option. It also helps that it's quite a bit cheaper than the 45, yet it doesn't feel cheap here in the interior. Instead, you get a cabin which is remarkably high-end for what is effectively an entry-level Mercedes-Benz product. The GLA is the SUV version of the company's A-Class hatchback. That being said, the second-gen GLA got many more adjustments of its own compared to the A-Class in the previous generation. It sits considerably higher, almost 100 millimeters higher than the previous GLA, and that's designed to give it more of an SUV flavor rather than looking and feeling like a pumped up hatch. As such, you do actually sit quite high over the traffic and your view out is more commanding than before. Plus, there's no doubt that you're in an AMG version. You get this really beefy steering wheel with prominent AMG badging and also customizable shortcuts here to performance features. And there are so many things, so many pieces of technology in these new generation Benz products that I'm also learning all the time. You have this Manatino dial here to change the drive mode, but you can also press it in order to go straight to your individual mode, which I find very appealing. We then have two shortcuts over here, and equally you can press those to change what the shortcut jumps to immediately. So if you want your engine start stop off to be over here because you don't like that feature, you can have that. You can have the dampers, you can have the exhaust, you can have the sport setting for the ESC all at your fingertips. It's pretty cool. We then have very prominent screens in this car. Two 10.25 inch screens, one controlled via the left trackpad on the wheel, one controlled via the right. Though the center screen is also a touchscreen and it can also be controlled via the center trackpad. I've gone over this tech quite a few times in previous Mercedes-Benz reviews from this new generation, but it still works pretty well here. Perhaps not quite as well as a rotary dial between the seats, but not all that far off. Now we've got these prominent and distinctive air vents which let you keep the airflow really strong, quite nicely damped toggle switches down here for the climate functions, and just nice heavy and hefty feelings to all of the switchgear in this car. Plus material quality is good, soft touch and nice stitching up here on the doors and on the dash. A little bit harder down here where your leg occasionally comes to rest, but not a huge deal. Now these seats are pretty supportive and comfortable. Black and grey two-tone is standard on the GLA 35. Black and red is an option on this car. And for Australia, the seats are electric, heated, and they have memory on both front seats as standard. Plus this panoramic roof I'm sitting under is standard too. So there's quite a high degree of specification, and it does make you think it's potentially worth the step over and above the GLA 250 that sits below the GLA 35 in the range. You'll also notice a few cues from the G-Wagon, including these big prominent SUV specific door grabs that the GLA gets over the A-Class. So that's the front seat. A lot to like about the GLA. Let's check out room in the back. First of all, the back door does open pretty wide, so fitting a child seat will be reasonably doable. The ISOFIX points are also really clearly exposed, so that certainly helps. Now, room here in the back is acceptable for adults, which is a bit of a surprise when you consider the GLA is this company's smallest SUV. it's still reasonably spacious in the second row. So for myself, it's 6 foot. My headroom is just enough underneath this panoramic roof. I've got another inch or so. Legroom is very decent behind my own driving position, and tow room is plentiful. You could squeeze somebody into this middle seat if you had to, but the floor's pretty high and it's something of a perch. So I'd think of this as a very decent and usable 4-seater, and you'll be in the ballpark. Soft touch materials do continue back here, but it's more like a veneer of soft material over a harder base. That said, quite plush down here on the doors. We do have air vents in the back, which is good. And a flip down console with 2 more USB-C ports that joins 3 USB-C ports up in the front. Couple of little bits of odds and ends storage. No flip down armrest though, which is a bit of a surprise on a vehicle of this cost. But all in all, it's a good, spacious, usable rear seat. Heading around to the back of the GLA 35, you'll notice a few nice pieces of bright work, including this chrome piece down here to protect the opening of the boot. An electric tailgate is standard fit, which operates very smartly and quickly, and opens up to reveal a decently sized and practical boot. Now, the GLA is a small car. As I mentioned, it is Benz's smallest SUV and AMG's smallest SUV, so it doesn't need to be massive back here, but you'll still get a couple of large suitcases side by side without much of a problem. And you can also put down those back seats in a 40-20-40 arrangement, which would make this car pretty attractive to take to the snow. Now, we do have a sort of dual-sided bit of carpeting here, carpet on one side and a rougher material for dirty stuff on the other. Underneath this boot floor, we've got a tire inflation kit, no dedicated spare wheel, so if you're a country buyer, that's something you'll probably want to keep in mind. In terms of other features, we've got a couple of hooks. We have a 12-volt socket on this side and nets off to the left and right as well. Controls up here to either close the tailgate or lock the car and walk away completely. We're not going to do that though, because we're going to jump in the driver's seat of the GLA 35 and see what this entry-level Mercedes-AMG SUV is like to drive. So, what's the entry-level AMG SUV like to drive out here on the road? How similar is it to the A35 that it's pretty, familiar with? They share a chassis, a platform, an engine, and many cues, including almost the entirety of their interior. Well, it's an SUV, and when you make an SUV taller and higher than the passenger car that it shares a lot of its parts with, it's going to drive quite differently, even though there is that family resemblance and shared nature of what goes into it. That's particularly the case for the GLA, because when Mercedes-Benz were designing and developing the second generation GLA, they were responding to customer feedback, which was asking for a vehicle that was quite a bit higher set and taller than the previous car. The feedback about the old GLA and the old GLA 45 AMG was that it was just too much like a cladded hatchback, and customers wanted something higher. Now, that obviously has an impact on how athletic the new GLA is able to be, particularly in light of how fun the old GLA 45 AMG was to drive hard. So what's this new GLA 35 really like? Well, we'll come back to ride and handling in a minute. First of all, let's cover off what's under the bonnet, because this is part of the new breed of AMGs that are not a top tier AMG. They're still very sporty, quite high performance, but it doesn't have a bespoke AMG engine, which is going to turn some people off. Other people won't really care, and they'll just enjoy the GLA 35 for what it is. So it has Mercedes-Benz's M260 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, which produces 225 kilowatts of power and 400 newton meters of torque in this application. And that's up from 165 kilowatts and 350 newton meters in a car like the GLA 250, which uses the same base engine, but AMG give it a new turbocharger, new air cooler, new intake, new manifold, and of course a complete software redo as well. So while there are many shared characteristics with the engine in the GLA 250, and some of the feeling is pretty similar as well, it's a lot more serious. It feels boostier, it feels faster, response is better, and it even comes down to stuff like the various hose work in the engine bay is all cut down to be shorter, so that engine response time just becomes more efficient effectively in the GLA 35, and that's basically the feeling that you get. The GLA 250 and the Mercedes-Benz vehicles that use this 2-litre turbocharged engine are pretty sprightly, but they're not, you know, raring to go in the same way that the GLA 35 and the AMG version of this engine is. So that all seems fair enough. You know, when you're on it on a country road, it's quick, absolutely. It just doesn't shove you in your back in the same way that the new 45 series AMG engine does. And that will be coming out soon in the GLA 45, probably just before the end of this year, or maybe January 2021 in Australia. And that is a bespoke 2-litre unit, completely different engine, making a lot more power and torque, 310 kilowatts and 500 Newton meters. And as we discovered in the A45, that thing is a real ripper of a unit. But it does cost quite a lot more. So it really just becomes, are you looking for an SUV that's pretty fast, pretty warm, and you know, it will certainly be enough, or are you looking for a true standout, something that pushes the category forward in terms of performance, because that's what the GLA 45 is really designed to do. But back to the GLA 35's ride and handling, because this is where it isn't really like the A35. Now, we were very impressed by the A35. It's a comparison winner here on Chasing Cars. It beat out the outgoing Audi S3 and the new BMW M135i just by being really alive, super agile, quick, really great turn in, a really nicely balanced little unit, that AMG A35. Now the GLA 35 shares some of those traits, but in every sense it just feels more cumbersome and less keen to do the things that you want of it. Because we're riding so much higher than the A35, it just feels a little blunt. Don't get me wrong, this is an enjoyable performance SUV to drive, and it's extremely competent. The grip levels from the Continental Conti Sport Contact 6 tyres are really good. The 4MATIC all-wheel drive system isn't afraid of sending torque rearward to give you really optimal traction out of a wet corner. It doesn't feel slippy and front driven and then you get a big burst of rear torque. It's nice and linear and it's well done. The problem is more the communication to the driver. So the A35 hatch has this real alacrity to its steering, turns in really well, dives for apexes, just a really fun and surprisingly athletic vehicle to drive, given that it isn't the top tier AMG A-Class. And the GLA, a lot of that goodness is still there, but it just doesn't feel as electrically connected to your hands through the steering wheel. And its limits are a little bit lower. There's a bit more push understeer that comes into it when you start cornering more quickly. And while there isn't too much body roll, AMG have been very good at keeping body roll levels really low in the GLA 35. There's been a considerable stiffening of the suspension compared to the A-Class, particularly, I feel, at the rear end. And that means that the GLA 35 is quite a bit rougher around town than the A35. You notice potholes and expansion joints more, and that's a bit of a shame because the A35 is really supple and nicely balanced. So personally, I'd go the A35 hatch or sedan. If you really do want this drivetrain and powertrain in an SUV form factor, then the GLA 35 does make sense. It just isn't the sweetest of this bunch. However, like the A35, it is very safe. We have adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist that works really quite strongly, a good 360-degree camera that projects onto this crisp screen here, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, forward collision warning. So, you know, it does feel like a sophisticated little car. So that's a look at the new Mercedes-AMG GLA 35 SUV. There's a lot to like about this little performance crossover. It's nice and compact and four-square on the road, which endows it with quite enjoyable driving dynamics, while the ride quality is easily livable enough to make this quite a practical, enjoyable, fiery little daily. The amount of performance on tap, pretty good for our roads. It's not outrageously fast, but nor does it need to be, because if you're after that, the GLA 45 is just around the corner. So you can let me know what you think of the GLA 35 down below this video. Does a car like this appeal, or would you go for the A35 hatch or sedan instead? Let me know in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.